In the year 121 AD, in a house on the Caelian Hill in Rome, a boy was born who would become the most powerful man on earth. He would command the largest military force in human history. He would rule over an empire that stretched from the gray shores of Britain to the deserts of Mesopotamia. 60 million people would live and die at his word. And every night, after the audiences and the councils and the judgments, after the generals left and the senators stopped flattering, this man would sit alone in a tent or a palace or a camp on the frozen edge of the Danube, and he would open a notebook. And he would write to himself, not for publication, not for posterity, not for anyone to read, just for himself. Reminders, corrections, warnings. Please, you could leave life right now. Let that determine what you do and say and think. The things you think about determine the quality of your mind. Your soul takes on the color of your thoughts. Waste no more time arguing about what a good man should be. Be one. That notebook survived. Against all odds, across 2,000 years of fire, war, collapse, and forgetting, it survived. And today it is known as the Meditations, the private journal of Marcus Aurelius, the last good emperor of Rome, the philosopher-king that Plato dreamed of and history produced exactly once. This is the story of how a boy who never wanted power became the man who wielded it better than anyone who ever lived. And it begins not with an empire, but with a family, a classroom, and a question that most people never bother to ask. What kind of person do I want to be? Marcus Aurelius Antoninus was born on the 26th of April, 121 AD. His birth name was Marcus Annius Verus, and the family he was born into tells you everything about the world he inhabited. His father, Marcus Annius Verus III, came from a family that had emigrated from Spain generations earlier. They were not old Roman aristocracy. They were new money, provincial money, the kind of family that had clawed its way into the senatorial class through land, trade, and strategic marriages. By the time Marcus was born, the Annii Veri were wealthy, connected, and politically positioned. But they were not yet at the center of power. His mother, Domitia Lucilla, was richer. Her family owned brick factories on the outskirts of Rome, an industry that generated enormous wealth in an empire that was constantly building. Lucilla was educated, cultured, and by all accounts a woman of genuine moral substance. Marcus would later credit her with teaching him simplicity in my way of living, far removed from the habits of the rich. Remember that, because when you understand who Marcus Aurelius became, you realize that the seeds were planted here. Not in the Senate, not on the battlefield, in a household where a mother taught her son that wealth was not a measure of worth. His father died when Marcus was young, probably around 3 years old. Marcus barely remembered him, but he wrote about him decades later in the first book of the Meditations, listing the qualities he had been told his father possessed: modesty and a manly character. 2 words, that is all he had, a reputation and a ghost. And he carried both for the rest of his life. After his father's death, Marcus was raised primarily by his grandfather, Marcus Annius Verus II. The grandfather was a heavyweight. He had served as consul 3 times, an almost unheard of distinction, and was a close friend of the Emperor Hadrian. The grandfather's house on the Caelian Hill was where Marcus spent his childhood, and it was a house that orbited power the way satellites orbit a planet. Close enough to feel its gravity, not yet consumed by it. And here we need to talk about Hadrian, because without Hadrian there is no Marcus Aurelius. At least not the Marcus Aurelius that history remembers. Hadrian was one of the most complex emperors Rome ever produced. Brilliant, cultured, paranoid, cruel, visionary. He rebuilt the Pantheon. He constructed the wall across Britain that still bears his name. He traveled the empire more than any emperor before him, personally inspecting the legions, touring the provinces, absorbing the cultures of the people he ruled. He was a lover of Greek philosophy and art, and he surrounded himself with intellectuals. He was also capable of extraordinary violence. He executed 4 former consuls at the beginning of his reign, men who may or may not have conspired against him. He was mercurial. His moods shifted like weather. The people around him learned to read the atmosphere the way sailors read the sky. But Hadrian was also watching. He was watching the boys of the senatorial families, assessing them, measuring their characters, because Hadrian had no biological son and the question of succession haunted him like a toothache that would not resolve. And somewhere in those years of observation, his eye landed on a boy. There is a detail from the ancient sources that is so human, so specific, that it has the ring of truth. Hadrian reportedly gave the young Marcus a nickname. He called him Verissimus. It is a play on the boy's family name, Verus, which means true. Verissimus means the truest one, the most genuine. Think about what that means. The most powerful man in the world, a man surrounded by flatterers and schemers and ambitious climbers, looked at a child and saw something that stood out precisely because it was not performed. Authenticity. In a world built on masks, this boy was not wearing one. Marcus was probably around 6 or 7 when Hadrian began paying attention. And Hadrian's attention was not a small thing. It was a spotlight that could make or destroy a family, and it fell on the Anii Veri. Now, Hadrian did not immediately adopt Marcus. The succession plan was more complicated than that and involved layers of political calculation that reveal just how Byzantine Roman imperial politics could be. Hadrian was dying. He likely had congestive heart failure, and his health was deteriorating rapidly by the early 130s. He needed a plan. His first choice for successor was a man named Lucius Caius Commodus, whom Hadrian adopted and renamed Lucius Aelius Caesar. This man was handsome, charming, politically useful, and almost certainly chosen because Hadrian had a personal attachment to him. But Lucius Aelius was in poor health himself. He suffered from what was likely tuberculosis, and on the first day of January, 138 AD, Lucius Aelius died. Hadrian's succession plan collapsed in a single morning. Hadrian, now visibly declining, made a new choice, and this choice would shape the next 50 years of Roman history. He adopted a man named Titus Aurelius Fulvus Boionius Arius Antoninus, a mouthful of a name for a man who was the opposite of Hadrian in almost every way. Antoninus was calm where Hadrian was volatile. He was conservative where Hadrian was experimental. He was domestic where Hadrian was restless. He was kind where Hadrian was cutting. And Hadrian attached a condition. The deal was this: Antoninus could be his heir, but Antoninus had to in turn adopt 2 boys. One was Marcus Annius Verus. The other was Lucius Caius Commodus the Younger, the son of the man who had just died. Both boys would be Antoninus' heirs. Both would be raised as princes. Marcus was 16 years old, and with a stroke of Hadrian's pen, his life changed forever. I want you to pause here and appreciate what just happened to a teenage boy. Yesterday, he was the bookish grandson of a well-connected senator. Today, he was the adopted son of the heir to the Roman Empire. Tomorrow, the entire machinery of imperial education, expectation, and surveillance would be pointed at him like a telescope. Most teenagers would be intoxicated by this. The power, the attention, the certainty that one day the world would be yours. But the ancient sources are remarkably consistent on this point. Marcus did not want it. He was not horrified by it. He was not rebellious. He simply did not light up the way ambitious people light up when power approaches. He accepted it the way a serious person accepts a heavy responsibility. Not with enthusiasm, with gravity. And this is where his education becomes the most important part of the story. Because the man Marcus Aurelius became was not made on a throne. He was made in a classroom. And the teachers who shaped him were not ordinary men. By the time Hadrian noticed him, Marcus was already deep into his education. Roman aristocratic education followed a standard pattern: grammar, rhetoric, literature, philosophy. Most boys moved through these stages dutifully, absorbing enough to sound intelligent at dinner parties and make persuasive arguments in the Senate. Philosophy was usually the last course, a garnish on the main meal of rhetoric and law. Marcus inverted the entire order. He fell in love with philosophy first, and he fell hard. The sources tell us that he encountered Stoic philosophy around the age of 11 or 12. His painting teacher, a man named Diognetus, introduced him to the philosophical life, and apparently made such an impression that the young Marcus adopted the habits of a philosopher. He began sleeping on the ground instead of his bed. He wore a rough cloak. He practiced the kind of physical austerity that Stoics recommended as training for the soul. His mother had to intervene and persuade him to sleep on a couch at least, covered with animal skins. A compromise between adolescent idealism and maternal common sense. But it was not just an adolescent phase. It was a conversion. The philosophical life gripped Marcus at his core and never let go. And the teachers who nurtured that grip were some of the finest minds in the Roman world. There was Apollonius of Chalcedon, a Stoic philosopher so revered that when Marcus invited him to the imperial palace, Apollonius reportedly replied that the student should come to the teacher, not the other way around. And Marcus went. The future emperor walked to the philosopher's house. He later wrote in the Meditations that from Apollonius he learned freedom of will and undeviating steadiness of purpose, and to look to nothing else, not even for a moment, except to reason. There was Junius Rusticus, perhaps the most influential of all Marcus teachers. Rusticus was a Stoic of the old school, a man who valued substance over style, and who reportedly introduced Marcus to the writings of Epictetus. Epictetus, the former slave who had become the greatest Stoic teacher of his generation. A man who taught that the only things in your control are your own judgments, desires, and actions, and that everything else, health, wealth, reputation, the behavior of others, is not your business. Marcus devoured Epictetus. The echoes are everywhere in the Meditations. And Rusticus taught him something even more important than philosophy. He taught him to distrust performance. Marcus wrote that Rusticus showed him the need to be corrected and reproved, and not to be offended at it. To not turn philosophy into a costume. To not use Stoic language to sound wise while living foolishly. To actually do the work. There was Sextus of Carinthia, a grandson of Plutarch, from whom Marcus learned to be tolerant of ignorant persons and of those who form opinions without consideration. There was Alexander the Platonist, who taught him not frequently or without necessity to say to anyone, or to write in a letter that I have no leisure, because using busyness as a status symbol was a form of dishonesty. There was Claudius Maximus, from whom he learned self-government and not to be led aside by anything. Read the first book of the Meditations and you encounter something extraordinary. It is a gratitude list. Marcus, at the peak of his power, sat down and wrote out every person who had shaped him and the specific virtue he had absorbed from each one. Not their intellectual contributions, their character, how they lived, how they treated people, how they handled difficulty, how they showed up when no one was watching. This was not a man who saw education as the accumulation of knowledge. This was a man who saw education as the formation of character. Every teacher was a mirror. Every lesson was a question. What kind of person are you becoming? And here is the part of the story that almost never gets told in the documentaries and the Instagram quotes. This education did not happen in a vacuum. It happened under enormous pressure, because while Marcus was studying philosophy, the empire was watching him. Every meal, every friendship, every public appearance, every word he spoke was noted, analyzed, and reported. He was living in the imperial household now. Antoninus had become emperor after Hadrian's death in 138, and Marcus had been brought into the inner circle. He was Antoninus' designated heir. He was engaged and then married to Antoninus' daughter, Faustina. He was being groomed for the most demanding job on earth, and the grooming was relentless. Antoninus was a hands-on educator. He involved Marcus in the business of government from an early age. Council meetings, legal proceedings, diplomatic audiences, the mundane, grinding, unglamorous reality of running a bureaucracy that spanned 3 continents. Marcus watched Antoninus govern for 23 years before he took power himself. 23 years of apprenticeship. 23 years of observing a man who, by all accounts, was one of the most decent human beings to ever hold absolute power. He wrote about Antoninus in the Meditations with a reverence that goes beyond political respect. He described a man who was neither supercilious nor a slave to popularity. A man who examined everything carefully and was never in a hurry to judge. a man who never displayed anger or any other passion, but was at the same time entirely free from all affectation. A man who wanted nothing for himself. This is the model Marcus absorbed. Not Alexander the Great, not Julius Caesar, not the warrior kings and conquerors that Roman boys were raised to worship. His model was a quiet, dutiful, patient man who did his job without drama and treated people with consistent decency. And there is a lesson in that which goes far beyond ancient Rome, because the world has always been obsessed with flashy leadership. The visionary, the disruptor, the charismatic figure who bends reality to their will. But Marcus learned something different. He learned that the highest form of power is the power exercised with restraint. That the best leaders are not the ones who leave monuments, but the ones who leave institutions that outlast them. That character is not what you display in the extraordinary moment, but what you practice in the ordinary ones. By the time he was in his late 20s, Marcus was the most prepared heir in Roman history. He understood the law. He understood the military. He understood the provinces. He understood the economy. He had been in the room for every major decision of Antoninus' reign. And he was miserable, not visibly, not dramatically. The sources do not describe a man in crisis, but the meditations reveal something that the public persona concealed. Marcus did not want to be emperor. He did not crave power. He craved the philosophical life, the life of study, contemplation, and moral refinement. The life that his teachers had modeled for him and that he had fallen in love with as a boy of 12. There is a letter that survives from Marcus to his rhetoric teacher, Fronto, written during this period. And in it you can hear the tension. Marcus writes about his duties with dutiful respect. But when he writes about his philosophical reading, the prose comes alive. The words quicken. The joy is palpable. He is a man writing about the thing he loves from inside a life he did not choose. This tension would define his entire existence. The philosopher who did not want to rule, ruling. The introvert on the world's most public stage. The man who wanted nothing more than a quiet room and a book, spending his life on horseback at the edge of the empire, fighting wars he did not start and solving problems that never ended. And here is what makes Marcus Aurelius extraordinary. He never resolved the tension by choosing one side. He never abandoned his duty for his philosophy. He never abandoned his philosophy for his duty. He held both for 20 years, until it killed him. But that is the story of the later parts. For now, we are still in the formation. Still in the years when the marble was being sculpted, but the chisel had not yet reached the face. In the year 145, Marcus was made consul alongside Antoninus. He was 24 years old. He had been given the title Caesar 5 years earlier. The political trajectory was set. The machinery was in motion. But the man inside the machinery was still being formed. Still reading Epictetus by lamplight. Still wrestling with questions about anger and desire and the proper use of time. Still writing in his notebook the kinds of sentences that betray a person who is fighting an internal war as real as any fought on a frontier. How much time he gains who does not look to see what his neighbor says or does or thinks, but only at what he does himself, to make it just and holy. He wrote that to himself, not to inspire you, not to build a brand, not to sell a book. He wrote it because he needed to hear it, because even the most prepared man in the world, standing at the threshold of ultimate power, was struggling with the same thing every human being struggles with. The gap between who you are and who you know you should be. That gap is where the meditations were born, not on a throne. In the space between a young man's ideals and the weight of reality pressing down on him from every side. And in 161 AD, the weight would become absolute. Because Antoninus Pius, after 23 years of stable, unremarkable, quietly excellent rule, would close his eyes for the last time. And Marcus, the boy who never wanted to be emperor, would stand up and walk to the throne. Not because he wanted to, because it was his duty. And for a Stoic, there is no higher word in any language.